This is Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randy Baier, and we're going to talk about education and train wrecks. Not necessarily the same thing, but
right.
still, those are fascinating topics.
Right. The academic world is ready to pounce on any topic worth doing the research on.
And the book I wanted to start with was Building Resilience in Children and Teens, Giving Kids Roots and Wings. And this is just one of these topics that's of great interest right now because people are trying to figure out, well, the schools are having trouble, the students are having trouble, what's some way of dealing with this? And what's really interesting is that the author, who is Kenneth R. Ginsburg, talks about needing a plan for developing resilience for kids from 18 months to 18 years. And to develop, and I found this fascinating, 7 crucial C's. Competence, confidence, connection, character, contribution, coping, and control. And if they have those, they can bounce back from challenges and manage stress, and also do other things like make wise decisions, recognize and build on their natural strengths, deal effectively with stress, foster hope and optimism, develop skills to navigate a complex world, avoid risky behaviors, and take care of their emotions and their bodies. And so I thought this is the kind of thing that I really want to see, because he talks about how in our fast-paced society we face many challenges when we try to raise young people with character. Our cultural values personal success, so how do we make sure that our children are hard workers but still value kindness, cooperation, sharing, and compassion for other people? You know, it is, to a large extent, dog-eat-dog kind of thing.
Well, you know, I see this a lot with incoming college students today, and I think this goes across the board. It's not just for the private schools or for the public universities. I think it cuts across all levels of education. There, in fact, are a lot of programs that monitor, help students build resilience, I guess is the way, but you know, in the academic or in the new world of, you know, attending college, but really having a structure to explore their ideas, to determine what's sort of not, you know, something that's false versus something that's real. It takes a time on task, you know, a life in a sense to develop that.
Well, something that's often hard to accept and practice, both as parents and teachers, is that children learn character by the values you teach and then what you do, how you do what you do. In daily interactions and how adults treat each other in your home. That's really a potent insight. And something that he suggests that they noticed in raising their daughters, he and his wife Celia, is to build up this affirmative process, is to notice children's acts of kindness. When they see something, then praise it. You know, and he says, often do we do that? Probably a lot, but they need to get that adult recognition for when they do that. And then notice acts of kindness and decent behavior in other people. That's another thing that's really important. Then watch television and be there when they receive unfiltered messages of violence and, you know, abuse.
Reminds me of my niece, a very headstrong and smart kid, but more or less addicted to television, especially when her mother is not around, my sister. And I was with her one night, and I was doing something on the computer. She's watching this medical show, ER, or Grey's Anatomy, I guess. And there's this surgeon who's a little messed up, who gets the other surgeons to start testing on themselves, cutting, but she really is a cutter. And I just looked over there and went, you know, Raina, what are you doing? Oh, this is very educational. My mother lets me watch this because it's educational. Completely straightforward. And, you know, that was, needless to say, not the case at all. And the value there, it was a test, you know, it was a test, kind of like, okay, what's the value? Does my sister really say that or not? Do I know she's fibbing to get out of the situation? And do I throw in my own opinion? Which I did, you know. It's like, okay, I don't know if this is a mixed message, but you're going to hear my feelings about it.
And that's a really deep issue, because if they see it on television, kids think that's the truth.
Yeah.
That's how they should
even
do it.
Even when they're smart enough to know it's not, it still sinks in somehow as a kind of reality. Especially those shows that are so well acted that it is very real.
You're believing.
Yeah, it's very believable.
Well, and there's been that research that just came out that said, you know, younger kids shouldn't be watching television at all.
Yeah.
Because they can't separate the reality.
Yeah.
Another thing they suggest is to work toward a better world. You know, instead of just saying, this is what I want, I'm taking it, the issue is, what's the better way to do it?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
give charity in the name of justice. You know, if your child is to count his blessings, he must know that many people are less fortunate. In a world driven by accomplishment, individual success, do you want your child to be aware that he or she has a responsibility to others? You know,
Yeah.
the privilege doesn't come just because you have the privilege.
Right. But I can hear almost any parent saying something like that, and yet we do have a great divide between sort of selfish behavior and magnanimous, or, you know,
It's one thing to say it,
behavior.
it's another thing to enforce it and to really show that that's an important thing.
Yeah.
Or is it just, as they say, lip service kind of a thing?
Right.
Another thing is to honor plurality, that we're a nation that draws strength from our differences. Within our pluralistic society, we may feel connected to certain familiar groups, but then be tolerant and not be prejudiced against ones that you don't understand.
Yeah.
Which has had some awful situations coming out. In fact, the presidential election, which has had far too much racism. Care about nature. When a child what child doesn't love to climb a tree, hike in the woods, or wade in a stream? So it's easy for children to relate to efforts to save the environment. But then you can also use that about, you know, well, this is what we need
broader
to save this
Yeah.
experience. Be human. Enough already with kindness, generosity, decency, altruism. Let's get real, he said. Every human, even those with children, and perhaps especially those with children, has a full range of emotions and traits, including selfishness, impatience, anger, and greed. Well, then we need to control that impulse.
Yeah, right.
You know.
Or know that we have it, and somehow, be aware of this. So, is this from the point of view of a classroom educator? Is some philosopher of education? Is it related to education, or is it related to sort of social work, child rearing?
It's in and out of the classroom.
Uh-huh.
You know, for example, there's a chapter on supporting resilience in military families.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had students who have served over in Iraq, Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
When they come back, they're suffering and their families are suffering. And so if you become aware of that, it's important. Another thing is the art and importance of listening. Too often people don't listen to each other.
Mm-hmm.
They talk at the other person.
I wish I could listen better.
Well, it's a flawed process because it's an art form that you
Yeah.
have to practice in order to be able to do it.
You really have to hear what they're saying, what someone is saying, not not hearing the first couple of sentences and then assuming, okay, this is what's coming there. I do that a lot. I mean, I know I do, because I'm just jumping ahead too fast to the conclusion.
Well, in American conversations, it's monologues going on where people are talking at each other,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not listening.
Well, you think that's American? Don't you think that's worldwide, possible?
Not necessarily, because we're more aggressive, we're more competitive, and we'll interrupt and talk over somebody. And research has shown that in American conversations, there's never a gap of more than 20 seconds because people get really uncomfortable if there's silence.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But he also notes about curb the interruptions. You know, if someone's saying something, don't interrupt them because you're so full of yourself that you've got to get your opinion in. And encouraging people to talk. You know, I was in a conference yesterday, and I was on a panel, and someone gave sort of an indication that she wanted to ask a question and put her hand down. And so I made a point that when we got to where I could ask her if she had something, I asked her. And that's the kind of thing that we need, I think, to do. Building confidence, it's really important to build people up and not tear them down. You know, we can easily... and here's one that we've talked about before, media literacy, media do's and don'ts. Do read and play with your child every day. Don't let your infant or toddler be exposed to television and computer games. I have students at college level that become, you know, asocial. There's, you know, one guy wrote in his journal that he's going to get a new video game.
Yeah.
And he just didn't plan on doing anything else except playing the game until he mastered it.
But you know, if video games didn't exist in the world, that particular person might have an asocial problem in whatever else was part of life. I mean, there's another side to especially with the learning aspect of gaming. There's a whole aspect of game theory, if I can put it that way, that challenges that opinion. I mean, that's pretty essentialist to just say no video games. Especially in the modern world, what do you do? We've been doing this forever. When I was like a kid, I was not allowed to have, you know, toy guns, right? And that's fine, but I was like, you know, like the other kids in the neighborhood, and, you know, we all played gunfight. And growing up with you know, I turned into some, you know, bleeding heart anti-war type, so and I abhor guns, but...
An interesting challenge is trying to go without any media for a period of time.
Yes,
No
yes,
cell
it's a good
phones,
exercise, right? Yeah.
No iPods.
Right.
I mean, I have students walk in, and the first thing they do is start.
I'm challenging the essentialist aspect of his argument. I absolutely agree with you. We don't know how to listen. We don't have patience. We are constantly looking for some kind of stimulation. And it's true. I mean, even as the simple act of reading an article in the newspaper, which essentially, basically they're short, but to get through to the end and take some time and ponder that is you know, an act of, I don't know, concentration, you know, thought.
This is kind of interesting. No more lectures.
From?
In classroom.
In school. We're talking school.
There's no
the
more
whole
lectures.
expert, top-down kind of framework.
That tunes the students out.
Yeah, yeah.
Susan told me if someone starts doing that, it starts going on and on and on and on.
But isn't it difficult to do that? I mean, it's difficult to get away from that frame because you've spent so much time. I mean, you in the general sense, we have spent so much time, you know, learning about some field or some particular thing we're passionate about, and we want to kind of pass it on, and you know, we get excited about it too. There's a gift there in being able to balance that, bring somebody along.
But it isn't about you talking at the student. It's about the student learning and developing to understand by becoming involved with it.
Right, right.
And you know, a lot of my students talk about that, where all kinds of horror stories where, you know, some instructors still don't really use the textbook.
Yeah.
They get up and lecture off PowerPoint of their favorite book. But use the test. You know, the tests are geared toward the textbook.
Oh, from the textbook, right.
Yeah, and so then the students are
packaged
having
text.
to read double.
Yeah,
you know.
Right. The 100 questions that are at the back with the multiple choice.
Well, in some of the disciplines at the one college I teach at, the tests are set up by the department based on the textbook.
Yes.
And that just...
You got to teach to the textbook.
Yeah, just trashes out the students.
Yeah.
But I think also, though, in life, it's better not to lecture at people, but to
Yeah.
ask questions.
Right.
Engage in dialogue, you know.
Well, I think this has a lot of value for what do you call it? The micro situations. He's talking about a macro, sort of a life trajectory, building resilience with kids and teens. But when I mean, you and I are at higher education, so when these kids and teens come into our zone, that's what I'm calling a micro situation. There's ways to build resilience within the way our particular education system is structured, whether it's classes, independent studies, your own investigation, your own reading outside of the context of a class. For me, that's one of the most resilient things you can teach somebody, is to say, it's not just English 102 here. Go out and read somebody who isn't part of the assignment. Get out there and start looking into something else. I mean, that's how to understand beyond the classroom.
But you're also saying, I think, that it's an accumulative process of growth.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't go from A to B to C without growing up to A, from A to B to
right.
C. And so we get students...
Platforms to jump from, whatever.
We get students that haven't had any of that.
Yeah.
And, I've had some students get pretty angry because they want me to do what they're used to. And I'll work with them to try to get them where they need to be, but they have an issue of accountability to do the work so they can get there.
Yeah.
And they're really quite angry, And then after a while, they settle down and do it.
Yeah.
Or sometimes they stop coming to class, and there's a phrase here of authentic success, and I like that phrase, because that means that you own it. It's yours. Nobody can take it away from you.
Right.
And one of my students stopped me in a store here locally, and she was really excited because she had just gotten a job a couple months ago where she's earning $45,000 a year as a supervisor in a major corporation. And the major thing that helped her do that were her writing skills.
Mm-hmm.
And then she finally really told that she was smart and an older student, but it was when that happened that she saw how valuable what she had learned was toward her future.
Yeah. Right.
And so that's authentic success. That's when you build it and now you know what the skills are and what you need to do.
I have a colleague who teaches ceramics and pottery, and she has in her field, there's a kind of apprenticeship model, I guess, over in general with something like pottery. You have to learn, it's kind of like 10 strokes with the right hand, 10 strokes with the left hand. You do this, and I'll tell you when to change. But she has a plan for how to teach something so that by the end of 6 weeks, 10 weeks, there's a product and people understand how to. Well, a couple of her students really objected to this process, and they said, "You're stifling my creativity. I can't be creative." And I've had her explain, how this goes against her method and the way she was taught, and that is creativity comes from knowing your stuff, literally knowing the clay. That's when creativity happens. So she was giving them these base platforms on which they could actually be creative, basically them applying glazes that they wanted to a structured piece of pottery that they had to do based on her direct instructions. So she was trying to mix the two. But it challenged what you're talking about, because she was actually trying to build some kind of a developed authenticity, within
Well,
that.
I tell my students that they're learning a craft. And in every craft, there's a basic skill set. In my role, when you learn a craft, you need a mentor. And that's my job. I can show them how to do it. But as the learner, they need to get the sense experience of what it is to do it properly.
To develop that, yep. Yeah.
And you can't hurry that through. You can't just say, it's done. Well, no, there's a certain thing you need to go through.
Right.
And the ones who hang in there and do it, they then know it's authentic. They can replicate that anytime they want. And there's a larger discussion about creativity, it isn't just, off the wall kinds of stuff is pretty deliberate, based on what you can do with the materials you're working with. One of my favorite examples are the sculptors who started working in marble, and as they worked with it and saw how the vein of the marble was developed, or they were interacting with it, they couldn't do the original design they had, like have an arm out like this, because it would be too fragile.
Right. Interesting.
And so that's part of your materials. One of the other things he talks about is discipline. But he's not talking about control. He's talking about, I think, persuasion. And I think that's really important. And this is about overcoming your authoritarian side. The first thing you want to do is enforce the rules.
Well, he seems to be maybe hinting at personal discipline, an approach.
Well, in dealing with students is you do need to set boundaries.
Yeah.
And you do need to enforce them. And deal with that. There's positive ways of doing it. One is to praise, like he was saying earlier, that when something goes right, to praise them for doing it that way. Have appropriate consequences for what's going on. I had one student that came in and told me, well, I've been a crack addict and dealer for 27 years. And I told him, but it's my classroom and my rules. And it didn't take him long, and he was starting to, go past those rules.
Yeah.
And I took him out in the hallway because I don't embarrass students. I said, you can't do that. And so he lasted about one more class and stopped coming.
And he dropped it.
But the key thing, I think, with discipline is talking with the person, engaging in dialogue to understand why are they doing that. And I think there's too much of this just slap them up alongside the head and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't change. What changes is the attitude. So it's a pretty interesting book that I think is really helpful. And also that each child is different. Each community is different, but it's still basic skills. So, you want to talk about the math and movies?
Well, this one, yeah, I'd love to. This is math, and math goes to the movies. Of course, it's got the marquee bit. Burkhard Polster and Marty Ross. They talk about well-known movies that might come to mind, like Good Will Hunting. The first thing I did was say, okay, did they talk about Good Will Hunting? And others such as Stand and Deliver, A Beautiful Mind, of course, and others from the 50s, 40s, way back in film history. They seem to have broken down the films into types of films. So Beautiful Mind or the Good Will Hunting. Well, Good Will Hunting is under the category whiz kids, so it's about smart math people, smart people. The Beautiful Mind would be under, actually I don't know the exact category, but they have a different category, like, troubled philosophical issues. The mind is too big for the person that holds
genius.
It. The genius. Thank you. That's the best. And even the movie Die Hard appears in here because there are these mathematical computations and problems going on. So there are certain tropes in movies that work, and some of the math, figuring out what's going to happen in a detective or a mystery movie, and things based on calculations. It's interesting how so many procedures are really behind a lot of the things we see. And so chapter by chapter they work through these. One thing that struck me, I started thinking about music when I was perusing the volume here, and that is that many of the number calculations that are mentioned in this book I learned about through music. Fibonacci series, for instance, numbers that when added to themselves come up with the next number. The golden section, the golden mean, the relationship of a spiral, if you look at things in nature or in musical compositions. The calculation pi for the circle, the formulation that gives you the radius or the circumference of a circle, and so forth. It's just kind of fascinating. And then, of course, they mention comedies, Abbott and Costello, certain goofy things that just come out of slapstick and things of that nature. But there's a lot of serious mathematics in here, where they talk about, say, tessellations and diagrams and formulations that are way behind our what's going on. For instance, calculus, where you calculate, you take a shape of a bowl, what's going to be the circumference of any slice of that bowl, or the total volume, square inches or whatever, of a slice of the bowl at any time. That's a calculation, a function that, you know, depends on its height and its width. And things like that go on in the movies, and there are scenes where there's a scene, literally, they're talking about, okay, this is the scene where so-and-so character explains to the class a computation. And then there are more subtle things where this is the computation that's behind the scene in this mystery, or in this, you know, this evil guy's mind who's trying to trying to beat the system and, you know, get the money from the bribe and things like that. So it's interesting, but there's a kind of an academic approach behind looking at certain key figures that we might know in popular culture, and how that relates to the field and how it's reflected. Because we have kind of a troubled view. I don't know if troubled is the right word. We have society has images of mathematicians. And of course there are serious social issues with the place of women in mathematics. There's a whole category, you know, women mathematicians, movies about women mathematicians, and their struggle against a system that's almost entirely perceived as male. You know, the drop-off of girls who are very good at math, and then they get to college or late high school and it drops out. And they're, you know, the science, they're not encouraged to continue in one way or another. So it's an interesting volume. They touch on all these aspects.
Well, if you look at math as a language, it's a deeper frame for understanding what's going on. We just interviewed Marina van Neumann Whitman, who was the daughter of John van Neumann, who essentially invented the modern computer, the logic and the framework for it.
I was going to say, is that related to the microphone family, the Neumann German microphone, but maybe not.
He was in the Manhattan Project. I mean, he was a friend and colleague of Albert Einstein. But one of the things that he had is he helped start the Advanced Institute for Study, you know,
at Princeton, Center for Advanced Study or whatever, Institute for Advanced Study.
You become aware there's a certain, I don't know, curse or challenge that when you have that kind of genius, what do? You know, how do you live with this? He was just extraordinary. He was just off the books, you know, as like Einstein was.
Yeah, true.
Well, I think we made it to the end of another program.
Great, thanks, Jim.
Thanks for being on Rip Rap.
Yep. See you next time.